get limbered up. So, stand up. Here we go again. And I want everyone to use your arms to simulate sprawling limb posture. And of course, for a sprawling limbed vertebrate, the vertebral column would be parallel to the horizontal plane. And I want the limbs to be in the rest position. So Sammy Salamander should just be standing there. Okay, now, a good number of you, it looks like you're in a holdup, okay? And that's not how the salamander would position its limbs, in the neutral position, okay? So make sure that the proximal part of your arm and the next part of your arm are all parallel to the floor. So in a salamander, that would be in a cross-sectional plane. Very good. Now it looks like no crimes are being committed. And number one, do pelvic rotation. Not your pelvis, but remember we're using our arms to represent the hind limb, but it could just as easily be the front limbs. A little bit of mixed results there. So the key thing you should be doing is keeping your arms stationary relative to your vertebral column and flexing the vertebral column alternately to the left and the right. Let's try that again for pelvic rotation. So notice, that's beautiful. I see everyone's hands, moving up and down. You're getting stuck up. You got to keep your right angle here, right angle at the elbow. There you go. That's perfect. Okay. Okay. So that's pelvic rotation. We're going to now move on to femur retraction. Again, endeavor to keep both parts of your arm when you start parallel to the floor. Okay, so this is our neutral standing position. And then from there, what happens? Retract your right arm. All I want to see is either femur or humeral retraction. Notice for these movements, it's vitally important to keep track of the plane in which movements occur. So all that should happen in femur retraction is that. Okay? Some people, I saw the angle changing and all kinds of funky stuff going on, okay? And then if you put your arm here and you do it really fast, you can make a farting sound. Have any of you ever done that, or don't kids do that anymore? Okay, very good. But we're not going to do that. And then long axis femur rotation. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Keep doing that. Yep. Long axis femur rotation. You can just do one limb. Oh, that's beautiful. And why is that so nice? Keep doing it, just like you're doing it. Because those two limbs are out of phase with each other, okay? They're being moved alternately. Those three movements, you can sit down now, thank you very much. I mean, who needs videos when you can do that, right? Okay, so remember that in these little videos, this box represents the girdle, and realize that when the distal portion of the limb moves posteriorly, that is referred to as retraction. But it's really important to realize that the femur is doing this with more or less within the horizontal plane. Okay? So it's vitally important, should the occasion arise where you need to describe these movements, to include reference planes or the part that's being moved. You need to be very precise. Oops. So here's pelvic rotation. And then I'm sorry, this is retraction. Retraction is when the distal part of the limb moves posteriorly. The opposite movement of that, when the distal part of the limb moves anteriorly, is protraction. So this is protraction, retraction. Protraction and retraction is useful for providing propulsive force. Protraction simply repositions the limb for another cycle so that it can retract again and therefore propel the animal. And we had some wonderful examples of long axis femur rotation. Again, it's important to say long axis femur rotation because after all, if you look at the femur moving like this, represented by my humerus, that is a rotating movement in a horizontal plane, but we refer to that one as retraction. Okay? So does everyone get that? Okay, here's the long axis of my arm, and I'm simply spinning that. Okay? And these are biggies for the propulsion of sprawling limb locomotion that are inconsequential for the locomotion of vertebrates with erect limbs. So simply by virtue of the starting position of a sprawling limbed vertebrate, a bunch of different stuff happens to use these structures for propulsion than in our legs, which are a good example of upright limb posture. Now, in addition to these things that are really important for sprawling limbed vertebrates, another thing that does happen, of course, is that while the foot remains on the ground, the joint is extended. Okay? That happens for virtually all types of limb locomotion, vertebrates, invertebrates, regardless of limb posture, and so on. Okay? Realize, in theory, any one of these movements theoretically could propel a sprawling limb vertebrate. But it's important to realize that in the real world, all this stuff goes on at the same time. So it's a little tough when you're looking at videos of a salamander or a newt walking to kind of keep track of those movements in different planes. Okay? So the legs are used to move. As you all know well, limbed animals can move over a wide range of speeds. And speed is simply equal to the product of stride length times stride frequency when you have rhythmic movements. So we have another example of how animals can modulate speed by some combination of modulating the amplitude of a movement and the frequency of the movement. Hopefully that reminds you of swimming fishes, where fish can modulate both the frequency and amplitude of the tail beats to modulate their speed. I want to make sure everyone knows what a stride is versus what a step is. It's important that you use these as follows rather than common usage. So that can kind of get tripped up. So very simply, a stride is a complete locomotor cycle. Okay? And very often, you'll go from footfall, my right foot's down, My right foot's down again. So I could go from right footfall to right footfall. If I wanted, I could go from right takeoff to right takeoff, left footfall to left footfall. As long as it's a homologous event, we could do that. Okay? So notice that a complete locomotor cycle for a pair of limbs within a girdle involves movement of both legs. A step is just the distance traveled when one particular leg is on the ground. So now my right leg is just touching, I'm going forward, 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 and my right leg is off. That distance that I traveled only when my one reference foot was on the ground is a step. Okay? Step length is determined simply by all of these various movements of these different parts. It's just based on simple geometry. Stride length can be more complicated because as animals go faster, they may not always have contact with the ground. So there, the forces become important for actually the animal leaving the ground. But for understanding step length, if you understand the geometry of the movements, then you should be able to understand the consequences of variation in limb morphology for affecting step length. So, get your heads together quickly. Working 2 or 3 thereabouts. For those 3 major movements that are important for characterizing sprawling limb posture, what's one of them? Give me one movement.
Femur rotation.
Someone else, give me another one.
Femur retraction.
Give me another one.
Long axis rotation, femoral rotation.
Pelvic rotation.
Oh, pelvic.
What was meant by this?
Long.
And then what's left?
Pelvic.
Pelvic rotation.
Marker here. So just make a little table where you have an increase in the length of the femur or an independent. We're just considering one of these in isolation. Okay? If the length of the femur is increased, does step length involving only this movement increase, decrease, or stay the same? So put a plus for increase, put a 0 for stays the same, put a minus for decrease. Okay, let's see what you got for this one. Who says increased femur length increases step length? Raise your hands. Does anyone say it decreases step length? Okay. And let's see, increase, decrease, stay the same. So it's the case that you increase the length of the femur and you get a longer step. Raise your hands again for everyone that said yes. Okay, who wants to explain how? Here's a long femur, here's a short femur.
When you're moving the femur up,
Look, if this is the femur, we're doing that, right? That's long axis femur rotation. If you're looking at this in lateral view. So if I hold the carpenter square here and make a short femur, or I hold the carpenter square back here, does the component of movement along the x-axis change? Okay. Because you just have long axis rotation of something, it doesn't matter if this doggone thing's 3 meters long. Okay? That's not going to affect it. Increased tibia length. Does that increase step length? Raise your hand. No effect? Raise your hand. Does that decrease step length? How? We've got most people saying that increases step length. How?
If you think about it, like, if you had a longer tibia right here, you'd be reaching further if it was longer, but if it was short, you'd only be reaching like that far.
Okay, so if the tibia ends where my finger is, and we have a given angular excursion, look at how far my finger is going back and forth, right? So this would be a lateral view of long axis femur rotation, in addition to me smashing my head on the screen. If we now look down here for a longer tibia, and if I do the same angular excursion, we get a greater linear displacement. Okay? So morphology can have direct consequences on step length. Actually, if the animal's just walking, that's going to affect stride length as well. And animals with different morphology potentially can have a morphology that facilitates enhancing step or stride length as a mechanism for enhancing speed. Okay? Work through the remainder of that table and don't just give the answers to yourself. Provide an explanation, potentially make a little sketch to make sure you don't fall into some traps. Okay? Alrighty. How are limb movements coordinated? We've actually seen a precedent for this in some of what we discussed for the paired appendages of fish. We generally see foot placement involving diagonal couplets. Okay? So that means if we go diagonally from right fore to right hind to a coarse approximation, they move at the same time. Okay? Whereas the two limbs within a girdle move alternately. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So presumably, this is the ancestral condition for tetrapod locomotion. When you look at its distribution onto a phylogeny, this would be the most parsimonious explanation, is that this actually popped up in ancestral tetrapods. So let's sort of follow through some of that with a simple little stick figure. Okay? And let's start first, if we just consider the theoretical case where all that's going on is the limbs are protracted and the limbs are retracted. So theoretically, an animal could move by doing that. This is a rudimentary salamander, believe it or not. And this is a dorsal view. This would indicate the forelimbs, and I'm going to use a little X to indicate that the right forelimb is touching the ground. Remember diagonal couplets, so that means at the same time, the left hind foot is touching the ground. I'm going to draw a little dotted reference line to sort of keep track of things here. At a later point in time, this angle is decreased during limb retraction. So at a later point in time, we see something like this. Okay, so notice we still have the diagonal couplet foot contact. And then at a later point in time still, we see this. Oh, come on, marker. There we go. Okay, so that would be 1/2 of a locomotor cycle. All right, where this diagonal couplet is touching the ground. So just a little bit after this, in order to prepare for the next step, the salamander is going to have to lift that foot up off the ground and then protract that limb relative to its body, so it can move it backward again during the next propulsive phase. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? All right. Now let's consider another theoretical case just to sort of isolate these movements, where Sammy salamander is flexed to the left, and when it's flexed to the left, that flexed vertebral column is going to cause the right forelimb to be maximally forward and the left hind limb to be maximally forward. So I'm going to draw little dashed lines to just provide a reference point for where the forelimb and hind limb are touching the ground. And in these examples, of course, the animals are moving up the blackboard. So a little bit later, we're still going to have these diagonally opposite limbs touching the ground as the body is straightened. And then at a later point in time, we can get this situation, again, solely by flexing the vertebral column. Okay? So there can be a coordination between lifting the feet up, putting them down, and bending the vertebral column. So theoretically, an ancestral tetrapod could primarily derive terrestrial locomotion using the vertebral column, and basically just using the limbs as struts. Okay? Whether or not this happened is not completely clear. But when you look at some amphibians and some salamanders, many of them do not have impressively large leg muscles. Okay, you've seen a lot of salamanders in lab, and if you think of those plethysodonted salamanders, their limbs are tiny, and yet they still use the limbs in locomotion, but they're not using those limbs in isolation because the limbs are attached to the vertebral column, right? And the vertebral column is alternately bending to the left and the right when the critters are walking. All right? So much for salamanders and likely scenarios for the ancestral tetrapod. What order of amphibians is far and away most diverse?
Frogs.
The technical name for the order?
Untitled.
Anurans, okay? Hugely diverse. So I think when most people think of amphibians, they probably think of a frog rather than salamander, because frogs are so common. But an interesting thing is, as we mentioned before, frogs are not a good model for reconstructing the ancestral tetrapodal condition because they're actually specialized for jumping. So we're going to look at some of the structural innovations that pop up in the ancestors of frogs and how those do or do not represent a departure from a more generalized condition. And if you're walking down the street and you see someone holding up a sign that says evolution is false because no intermediates have been found, you're going to say, but wait a minute, what about Tiktaalik? Well, now you've got another one in your arsenal. They don't buy that, then you can say, what about Ceratobatrachus? Okay? These things just roll off the tongue, don't they? Okay? All right? Anurans actually do stuff other than jump, and we'll get into that when we consider how they move. And again, keep track of these structure-function relationships with respect to the locomotion of this very derived group. I love this picture. On the top, we've got a dorsal view of a bullfrog skeleton, which you've seen in lab, right? On the bottom, we've got an extant salamander represented by Necturus, which you've seen in lab, right? We lack a course budget to allow us to get one of these, but this illustration is of Triadobatrachus. By my way of thinking, if some of you ever used drawing programs where you have a starting shape and end shape and use a blend tool and you can specify the number of steps, it almost looks like that's what's going on here, doesn't it? Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. But intermediates don't exist, right? Okay, so let's do a little inventory here. Keeping track of Triadobatrachus, where we use the salamander as representative of more generalized tetrapod anatomy, and a frog, a modern frog. And then how does Triadobatrachus compare to these two things? Is it intermediate? Is it salamander-like? Is it more frog-like? Now, some of these actually depend precisely on how you word the descriptions for what you would conclude. So let's consider Triadobatrachus versus modern anurans. And we find that it has an intermediate number of vertebrae compared to the ancestral tetrapod, but still more vertebrae than extant anuran amphibians. Okay? If we look at the shapes of the vertebrae, transverse processes are present in extant anurans. Triadobatrachus does not have these. So that resembles salamanders and ancestral tetrapods. Triadobatrachus has ribs with two little parts that attach to the vertebral column, the so-called bicapitate rib, and that is something you can also find in salamanders, but does not occur in frogs. Frogs lack ribs, okay? If you're looking for ribs in the frog skeleton, you're going to have a very long day in lab. And if we look at the pelvis, Triadobatrachus has a slightly elongate ilium, at least compared to extant anuran amphibians. And if we look at what's going on in the tail, if you look for a tail in an adult extant anuran, again, you're going to have a very long day. But in Triadobatrachus, the vertebrae that form the tail are still separate. But there are far fewer vertebrae in the tail of Triadobatrachus than in salamanders or ancestral tetrapods. So you've seen this urostyle in extant anurans in lab. Okay, if we look at the radius and ulna, so that's in the forearm, those two bones are separate in Triadobatrachus, and you've seen in the Necturus skeleton in lab, they're also separate. That's a generalized tetrapodal condition. Whereas in modern anuran amphibians, those two bones are fused. And similarly, on the hind limb, you have this generalized condition of a separate tibia and fibula in Triadobatrachus, whereas those bones are also fused in extant anuran amphibians. And then if we look at some of the things involved in the feet, again, you have to be a little careful how you word some of these things. But again, we see that these are somewhat elongate, okay? And so in that sense, it's intermediate. But on the other hand, there's still two distinct bones, and that resembles salamanders and ancestral tetrapods. Whereas in extant anuran amphibians, these are greatly elongated and fused rather than two separate bones. Triadobatrachus has a sacral rib. Extant anuran amphibians do not. I'm mainly emphasizing things that are relevant to locomotion here, but also if you look at the skull, Triadobatrachus has quite large orbits and a skull that overall comes to resemble that of extant and amphibians, but not in every detail. So depending on the particular trait, one could think of that as somewhat intermediate. Do we have enough stuff to make the case? I think so. Okay? So let's now focus on extant and amphibians and how they move. And of course, some of the variation in anatomy has a profound consequence on how they move. For an early larva of an aneurin amphibian, how does it differ in two key ways from an adult?
Most of them have a tail.
So the larvae have tails. Somebody else? Something else?
They don't have developed lungs, so they still develop.
Well, let's focus on locomotor stuff that's true.
Then they don't have limbs.
Yep. Okay. Pretty profound difference between tadpoles and adult aneurin amphibians. So that has profound consequences on how they move. And by Jove, are you getting tired of hearing about undulatory swimming? But again, this is something that evolved early in vertebrates and has widely been retained. So tadpoles swim using a type of undulatory swimming, but it only involves the tail because they have these little bodies that almost look like a little basketball and are actually quite rigid compared to the tail. Okay?
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad move on.
How many of you saw Finding Nemo? Okay. And to what order does Nemo belong? Think about that one. I can't even tell you off the top of my head. All right, but a nice example, you can see those waves in the tail, but that lobose body is not contributing to undulation. Okay? That's not a tadpole. Okay. Here's a tadpole of the bullfrog. You've probably seen these in the flesh. They get quite big, and in fact, in many areas, it usually takes them 2 years to become an adult, rather than 1 in the northern parts of their range. By contrast, here is a tadpole of the central linnets. Those are those little glass frogs, arboreal frogs found in the neotropics, and they lay their eggs on the underside of leaves. The tadpoles hatch, and they wiggle off that leaf, and they hopefully make their way to the stream, or they have a very bad day, okay? You can see some striking differences in the anatomy, and those differences in anatomy have consequences for what these tadpoles are good at doing. If you have a long, flat fin in a vertical plane, and if you're out of the water, you don't have a structure that's very effective for engaging solid surfaces. The other thing is, actually, there are all kinds of correlations between overall tadpole morphology and whether they're in still water versus running water. And these central linnets, as I mentioned, actually have to wiggle their way to the streams. And if you think of eels moving over land, a lot of the fishes that I showed you that make overland excursions are relatively elongate compared to many fishes that do not. So you don't see any, I mean, even mud skippers have a relatively tubular lower body, rather than either a deep body or just sort of a short, round body. Okay? All right. Well, adult aneurin amphibians do have legs. Those can be used for a variety of tasks. And here's a nice video clip of a European frog swimming in still water. Is that frog using the presumed ancestral pattern of limb coordination? Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hands. You're not raising your hands very high today. Take a chance. Columbus did. Look how badly that comes out. Okay. So, for the naysayers, what's different?
At the same time.
Yes, bilateral use of the limbs as opposed to alternating unilateral use. So keep in mind that not all the innovations need to be in structure. Behaviors and neural circuitry actually can and do evolve. Okay? So this is a drag-based mechanism of propulsion, and some of the fluid mechanics are rather similar to the bluegill when it used its pectoral fins. That way. Bilaterally retracting the limbs. So this is referred to as rowing, hind limb rowing. And if you're pushing against the water, let's look at a foot. There's the foot of a bullfrog, quite aquatic species of frog. Why have all that webbing between toes? Yes.
Surface area.
And what good is enhanced surface area?
Pushes against the water more than something with less surface area.
Remember drag-based mechanisms of fish swimming and momentum transfer to the water. You can increase momentum transfer two ways. At a given speed, you can push more water, or you can push a given amount of water faster. You can often get some hints about the ecology of frogs by looking at how extensive the webbing is. This is from a foot of Leptodactylus pentadactylus, and it's very often up in the leaf litter in tropical forest floors. Okay? What are some potential advantages of having a structure like this? Bones embedded within a flexible membrane.
You control how much surface area is being exposed.
Yes. Can someone else think of another group in which that happens? I can't hear anybody.
Would you be talking about this Actinopterygia?
I would be talking about Actinopterygia because there you also have rigid structures within a membrane. And Actinopterygia can also modulate the surface area. And they can also have some very complicated movements of the different fin rays as well. You don't see some funky stuff like that going on in the feet of frogs, okay? So, a nice example of analogous structures, not in any way, shape, or form homologous, but serving a similar function. So a similarity is a result of common functions. Pretty neat. Okay? Always keep an eye out for such things and sort of apply what you know about structure-function relationships in one group to a new group that we may be dealing with. Well, adult neurons can and do move on land, and that can happen in a variety of ways. Unlike the aquatic locomotion that we saw, again, I'm painting with rather broad brush strokes here. You commonly see alternating limb movements within the girdle when the neurons are walking, and in some rare cases when they run. But neuron amphibians are clever little beasties. Namely, they can also use bilateral limb movements when they hop and when they jump. So hopping is generally regarded as a rhythmic behavior and a smaller amplitude movement than a jump. So if you see some of the best examples of that is, you can see a little toe moving along, and those times of contact would be evenly spaced through time. I think it's kind of interesting that within neurons, running with alternating limb movements is actually extremely rare. And I can't open the file to show you, but that file should be available on the Canvas site. All the videos should be posted up there. This frog from Africa in the genus Cassina is not too shockingly referred to as an African running frog. And it runs, which is weird. What you're probably more familiar with is jumping in the neuron amphibians. And obviously they have a whole ton of specializations that allow them to do this. Okay, so these are super slow motion videos of a neuron amphibians jumping. And they are really good at doing it. Okay? And notice how in rhamid frogs, how big those hind limbs are compared to the forelimbs. So for those who are into fine dining, those would be the legs consumed, sadly, rather than the forelimbs. Okay? Now, you may not be aware that actually a number of the neuron amphibians can also burrow. Okay? And an interesting thing about a neuron amphibians, very, very different from us, is that you can actually have movement of the pelvis relative to the vertebral column. How much it moves and how it moves depends on the taxonomic group of frogs. So if this is the platform made by the vertebra, and my two fingers represent the greatly elongated ilia, when you look at the back of a frog, you often see a bump where the pelvis articulates to the sacral diapophyses. And the butt can move up and down relative to the vertebral column. Okay? Another type of movement that can occur, again, if this is the vertebral column and this is the urostyle, is that they can wiggle their butt from side to side relative to the vertebral column. Now, we can wiggle our butts, but when we do so, we're actually moving the vertebra. If your pelvis is moving relative to the vertebra, call 911 really fast. Something's breaking down. Okay? And then a really funky type of movement, not so common as these other two movements, is again, if this is the vertebral column and this is the urostyle, it can actually slide forward and backward, a translational movement rather than a simple rotational movement. Okay? So here's a Southeast Asian whiny tree frog jumping. Notice that bump in the back, and the Rhacophorid tree frogs are closely related to the Rhodes tree frog. So all that distance from that bump to the rear end shows you how elongated those ilia are. And notice there's quite an angle. If we were to draw a straight line there, that's about a 40, 45 degree angle, right? See how that angle changes? That's the vertical rotation. And a lot of frogs that are very adept at jumping have substantial amounts of vertical rotation. So it shouldn't be too surprising that the skeletal morphology constrains the type of movements that are possible and the magnitude of some of these movements that are possible. This is the skeleton of a bullfrog, whereas this is a skeleton illustrating greatly expanded sacral diapophyses. So they're big and flat, whereas in a lot of rhodes, these are nearly round in cross-sectional area. Okay? So if you have these things attaching to something that's flat, unless something very tricky is going on with the connective tissue, that's going to impede a rotational movement. Okay? And there are some patterns to where you see expanded sacral diapophyses in extant Femur amphibians, namely in some species that are specialized for walking, in others that are specialized for burrowing. The vast majority of Anuran amphibians that burrow do so with their hind legs, not their forelegs. They go down butt first, okay?
We have some boys eating high quality dog food in the field.
So here we've got the South American frog, the leptodactylus frog. So it's wiggling its butt, kind of holds the feet in, and commonly these Anuran amphibians have some keratinized tubercles on their feet that help act like spades, and you've seen that in the spadefoot toes in lab. Okay? So very different from most mammalian burrowing because they go rear end first. There are some differences that are conspicuous among different taxa. Which of these two frogs do you think would be a better jumper? The one on the left, the one on the right. The one on the left, big, long legs compared to this. I just love these guys, I'm sorry. They just look like little puffballs, don't they? Okay? And your handout, in fact, provides just some examples of how the jumping abilities of different groups, in fact, does differ. So hopefully, if you enter a frog jumping contest, you're going to have an edge on your competitors because you're going to pick something like this rather than something like this. Okay? We'll polish off froggy's locomotion stuff next time and then actually begin a new unit. just a couple odds and ends left.